Hi, this is Richard Edelman, and you're listening to The Trust Makers.
Hi, everyone. My name is Amanda Edelman. I am the Deputy General Manager for our Chicago office, as well as the COO of Edelman's Gen Z Lab. It has been an interesting time in the world, to say the least, in particular looking at Gen Z. We just released a report a couple of months ago that looked at some changes that generation had faced, whether it's in their aspirations, their beliefs, or even their fears, and in particular, what they wanted from brands. So with that being said, I am incredibly happy to introduce our guest today, Doug Martin, who is the Chief Marketing Officer for General Mills. Doug, welcome to the Trust Makers.
Amanda, thank you for having me. This is going to be a fun conversation.
Absolutely. So I wanted to start with a deceptively easy question, which is, look, the world has changed a lot in the past few years. And I think this is particularly relevant for any company that wants to appeal to Gen Z and as much in the cultural zeitgeist as General Mills. So I'm really curious just what you're seeing right now, and in particular, what you feel like has changed to, say, 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, you are, first of all, super right that the world is really changing right now. And if I think about, even 4 or 5 years ago, it's not that long ago. It feels like the pace of change in the complexity in the marketing ecosystem is really ramping up. One of the things 4 or 5 years ago, we were all very aware that streaming was the next big thing and that, one day linear would decline. And I feel like that's another example of something that has continued to accelerate faster and faster. And so getting, your audience together, if you're a big brand, we have a lot of big brands, we're in a lot of households, even just connecting with the right number of people is a little bit more complicated today than it used to be.
I'm really curious, when was this something that you and the team at General Mills started to pick up on and started to think about? Because I think perhaps we're all surprised by how much it's accelerated, but, to an extent, it's not super new.
Yeah, no, it's definitely not new news. And I think more than anything, it is us seeing day in, day out the places where the things that we thought were happening are happening. They're happening faster than we expected. And we're seeing, the examples of brands that are doing it well and the examples of brands that aren't doing it well. So this idea of, just taking audience fragmentation, we knew it was coming. I was a marketing manager on Cheerios probably 12, 13 years ago. And one of the struggles at that time was Cheerios has this incredible place as the first finger food. Baby turns 9 months old, and it's a really important developmental milestone to pick things up with your pincer grip. 12 years ago, we were like, well, we know that's important, but the problem is at any point in time in America, there are only X many 9-month-old babies. And that's because I think we had a very kind of TV broadcast approach to thinking about our marketing. That's just obviously not true anymore. Your ability to get that message to that person who's looking at their phone, the way you talked about, is very different than it was before. So in some ways, that's the exciting thing, is it allows you to click into more distinct benefits, more distinct communications that are very relevant or extremely relevant at a moment in time, rather than having to say one thing to everyone everywhere.
One of the interesting trends that our research picked up is this idea that for Gen Z in particular, the world has shifted from we to me. And this is actually quite a recent trend, because when we did our inaugural report in 2021, what we actually found is that they were this collective, almost altruistic generation of we over me. They went to rallies together, they were sort of socially idealistic, but now we're in this era of grievance. Unfortunately for young people, things feel more zero sum, and so they've become a little bit we over me. I mention this because I think that there's a connection there of having these sort of individual experiences, whether that's through a sort of linear advertising, whether that's through your relationship with a brand, and this sort of uplifting of the individual over the collective. I'm curious if that resonates at all, almost from a consumer psyche perspective.
Well, I tell you what really resonates is this idea that it's not easy for consumers right now. And I think Gen Z in particular, we've had a lot of conversation. They've been through a lot. You think about where they were at various developmental milestones, and it was tough. And so I think if you look at that, or if you look at people, dealing with economic uncertainty, any of those things, I think it's very natural in that moment in time when you're feeling unsure of what you can count on to think, well, at least I can figure out what's in it for me with this particular brand experience, et cetera. And so one of the things we've been talking about for a long time is that, our intention is for our brands to solve problems and deliver joy. And I think sometimes you can think about that, solve problems, and you can start up at a really high level of like, whatever, world peace and hunger. These are problems that brands should tackle. And of course, those are important issues. But I think what we've been very much focused on is let's make sure we're solving real problems in the real world for real consumers. And so, it can be that a brand like Pillsbury cares about important societal issues. And it also can be that it's Thursday, it's 4:00, and you got a young mom who's still got to make dinner again tonight. And that sucks. And I am sick and tired of coming up with ideas, and a brand that comes up with a real idea that works for me, that makes that process easier, that's solving a problem too. And then the flip side of that, I would also say is it's a good time to be delivering joy. And so when we're looking at some of our activations, I like to first react to anything we're looking at through a human lens. If I laugh out loud, like maybe there's something there. I was just looking at some kind of rough cuts of some creative spots and some extra things that got picked up on set. And there were a couple where I'm like, well, I don't know if that's a commercial or not, but it was funny. And we should find a way in service to our community to get this thing out in the world. And maybe the intention of this little piece of creative is just to make someone laugh and to bring them a laugh from a brand. And not every single thing we do has to solve all of the brand problems all at once.
What I'm really struck by and sort of hearing you speak about this is, frankly, your empathy and really understanding your consumers and, some of the broad challenges they face, some of the day-to-day challenges that people are facing. And frankly, that's one of the things that we try to do at the Gen Z Lab is that I think sometimes people are all very well intended in the type of work that they're trying to do and the type of problems that they're trying to solve. But I think if you don't understand the problem, if you don't understand the consumer, the work that you do can miss the mark if it's coming from a wrong base of understanding. And again, I think you've done such an excellent job at articulating who your consumer is and really empathizing with their experience from the sort of micro, dinner's frustrating, to macro economic uncertainty. I'm really curious if you think that is sort of a company-wide mindset and ethos, and as the consumer has changed, as the world has changed, how you've really been able to keep your finger on the pulse of, who your consumer is and what they experience and what they care about.
I mean, that's a huge and important question. And I think there are a lot of different facets to the answer. I will say, I always feel fortunate that, working in a company that sells food, like it is as fundamental as it can be. I always tell people, like, if you don't know anything about someone, but you knew exactly what they ate for 2 straight weeks, you would know a lot about someone. It's who we are. Then I would say there is a constant need to actually be with consumers and experience some of that emotion. That exact example about dinner time, it actually didn't occur to me how emotional that particular quote unquote problem is until you hear moms talking about it, right? It's not a mild inconvenience. It's like actually connects to how they perceive themselves as a mother. How successful am I doing this like incredibly important job is how I feed my family. So it quickly clicks down into things that are very deep, right? But you do need to spend some time with consumers in order to feel that emotion. And then I think the other piece is, my God, we have so much data now. There's so much, it feels like the sources of data are always exploding. And I think a newer challenge has become, how do we take all of those sources of data, which are inherently don't have a face and an emotion attached to them, but are telling you something quite important, and then go from the this is what's happening, so what does that mean? How do we take data sources like, retailer data, syndicated panel data, and say, wait a minute, there's something going on with snacking here. It's a change in behavior. Let's understand why. And then maybe after the fact, we put a face to it with talking to a consumer, but the speed with which we need to react to some of those kind of more, I would say, purely numerical type of data insights that are coming in needs to be increasing at all times.
Smart. I think everything you've shared makes a lot of sense. And I think one particular area that I'm struck by, as you're saying, you need to really understand the consumer. In our most recent trust barometer, our headline was crisis of grievance. And what that means is that a growing number of people around the world are feeling aggrieved. They're feeling resentful. They're feeling they're not getting their fair share. And this is particularly true for Gen Z. Gen Z is the most aggrieved generation globally compared to all others. And obviously, the consequences of this are not great for society, for how this generation feels. I'm really curious if this is something that you're picking up as you're keeping your ear to the ground around how consumers are feeling. And in particular, I think that there is a seeming tension that actually I think can be resolved in a most solutions-oriented way around bringing joy. And the tension, of course, is, okay, people are aggrieved, how do you make people laugh and imbue levity in things in a way that's not tone deaf, but actually is exactly what people need? And it seems like it's almost a tightrope to walk.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, if you have access to the internet, I think that grievance is something you're going to see pretty quickly. So we know the context of the environment. I think it may be a simple question with not a simple answer, or a good question with a complex answer. For me, I think there's two pieces of this. One is we've spent a lot of time talking about what does it take to build an enduring and distinct brand? Like, what are the things about your brand that are not going to change over time? And there's tactical things like, your colors and your logos and things like that. But I think actually clicking into what are the sort of values of your brand and how can those stay consistent so that you know how you want your brand to show up. I think maybe paradoxically, the other side of this is kind of realizing the role your brand plays in consumers' lives. So, when I'm talking to the team who are working on Gushers, I tell only you guys are thinking about Gushers 8 hours a day. 8 hours a day is hard to be as accomplished professionally as it seems that you are if you're spending that much time on Gushers.
Let's not minimize the importance of Gushers to my childhood.
Okay, fair. So a very small number of consumers. The point being, like, people are going through a lot, and Gushers and Fruit by the Foot and our role in this can be to be silly. We're not going to be silly about serious issues. In fact, we probably may not engage on certain serious issues, but like what we can be is 27 seconds of fun in a day in the way that you eat the product. We can be a couple of seconds of fun in the way that we communicate about the product. And we should feel good about that role. That is a positive and necessary role in society. And then on the flip side, you have a brand like Cheerios, which obviously is an emotionally connected and like deeper caring kind of a brand. So it's not going to be as silly, but, we are going to bring a level of care to our communications that has more of a family vibe and a nurturing vibe. So understanding those zones and saying, Cheerios never going to violate this. Gushers is always going to be over here, and then letting them kind of be in their lane in a world that is always going to be complex and have a lot of good and bad things going on.
Basically, you don't need to be all things to all people.
And you cannot be. Yeah, you really cannot be. That is a real recipe for failure for a brand. And one of the things, again, that we've been talking about is a brand has to make choices, partially because you've got a limited amount of attention you can go get. You've got a limited amount of dollars that you can spend. And so you have to decide what you care about, and it cannot be everything. And the things that you say you care about have to be consistent over time and come with action. So, a great example in our portfolio with the Nature Valley brand. Nature Valley cares about connecting people to the outdoors. And so as a part of that, we've been supporting national parks for 15 years. Like, this is something that we care about. Now, there are a lot of things you can imagine brands getting involved in that is going to be way outside of that realm. But like, this is what we care about, this is where we're consistent, and this is where we're going to leverage our voice, not everywhere.
In some ways, I think you guys are ahead of the curve, having this sort of perspective that you've had for a long time of being very well defined about the permission space for each brand. That's actually something that we're leaning into quite a lot right now, is this idea of the permission space and being scientific about how we define that.
Do you have a right to be in this conversation? Have you earned it? Yeah.
And to your point, what are you obligated to speak out on? And it's exactly as you say, is that it can't just be words sort of thrown into the ether. People are too smart now. And particularly Gen Z, they have this forensic ability to get to the truth because they were born as digital natives. And so it really has to be backed up with action. If you're making a statement, but things are not reflected in your ESG report on your website, or, whatever the sort of reporting framework is, or wherever the follow through is, if it's not there, people will find out and will call you out for it. So obviously very smart that you're sort of ahead on this. I do want to click in a little bit, which is, as you say, there are certain brands that are able to add more levity and be more silly and be more fun, gushers, among them. Are there ever times where you kind of pause and you're like, maybe we shouldn't do this. Maybe it's too fun. Maybe it's not the right moment or the right time, or you feel pretty confident in that consistently?
I mean, it's something that that we do now that we didn't do 10 years ago is we are always listening for what is the dominant conversation of the day. And there are times where we will say, you know what? No one needs to hear from General Mills brands today. Especially if you think about the social space, et cetera. So we might pause advertising if something particularly negative is going on in the world and everyone, just needs a day to focus on that. But I think the other thing that we're trying to do more on the learning side of things is find those opportunities to connect with consumers in a very limited way and sort of challenge how far can this voice stretch? The opportunity to say, what is too silly? Like, now this is wacky and it didn't make sense and I didn't like it and it annoyed me. And so we tend to test those things in a more controlled or limited environment to understand, because we end up having these amazing conversations where we're like, no, let's really define what the fruit by the foot brand of silly is. And they can sound ridiculous and probably conversations that if someone came in from another company, they'd be like, what are you talking about? But the is and is nots are really helpful. We are about wacky fun. We are not about making fun of. These kind of things can help really ground a team in where and how a brand might interact, because you cannot prepare for all of the things that are going to happen in the course of a year. And that is another huge change where it would be nice to come up with an annual plan and then run it. But you don't know what's going to hit, what's not, what are the conversations that are going to be surrounding your brand, et cetera. So you have to have a little bit of flexibility there.
Yeah. And I think that, again, very, very, very smart and in many ways ahead of the curve. I think that many brands for the past few years have been building their list of, what are we? Whereas fewer have been articulating the what are we not? Who are we not? And each of those is incredibly important because, to circle back to one of the words that you used at the beginning of the conversation, the world is so much more fragmented. And so what that means is that the opportunities that you can take advantage of or conversations you can participate in went from 1 to 100. It totally exploded. And so as a result, you have to be really judicious about where and how you show up, not just from a consumer perspective to ensure you're not diluting the conversation, but even from your own internal bandwidth, of your
completely. Yeah.
You can only do, 10 conversations, not 100, even if there are, potentially 100 that it could be relevant for.
I will say one thing that I feel has changed. It'd be interesting to look at your learning about when the we shifted to me. But one thing that I definitely feel has changed in the last 5 years is there was a point in time where there was you felt like there was a pressure for a brand to respond to everything. Negative event A, B, C, D, whatever it is, like, hey, what's Chex Mix think? And that was internally a lot of pressure where like, I don't know that Chex Mix needs to weigh in here. We're pretty excited about bringing 5 different things together in a snack mix. I don't know what we think about, serious issue number 1, 2, or 3. And so it felt like that pressure at that time was somewhat coming from younger, more idealistic consumers. And I do not feel that the same way. And I think people probably heard enough from brands where they're like, wait a minute, thank you, no thank you, that I think consumers appreciate the focus on what a brand stands for as well.
I think that's absolutely right. And it's exactly as you say, that pressure was actually the catalyst for us to start the Gen Z Lab in the first place. And it's exactly as you say, that there started to be more and more pressure on brands to speak out on every single issue. A lot of that did come from young people, but the stakes were very high because if you said or did the wrong thing, then you canceled. And so a lot of our clients felt paralyzed. And so again, that was our catalyst to create this, to help our clients sort of navigate that very treacherous terrain. To your question, we actually started to see a change about a year ago when we saw actually more and more political activity from Gen Z on the right wing, even some alt-right, and this is particularly across Europe, as well as the US, as well as different places around the world. And so we thought this was fascinating. Again, the stereotype of Gen Z being, generally quite left-wing. And so looked into that. And that's when we saw this data that they were highly aggrieved, creating a sort of zero-sum mindset that dovetailed with this more sort of politically fragmented perspective. So all this to say, sort of your perspective of the pressure of 4 years ago to respond to almost a checklist of items has absolutely receded as sort of a corollary with some of the political and otherwise psyche changes that I've just described. And I would agree with you, which is that I think people very much appreciate for brands to speak up and act in sort of areas that are relevant to them. I think you, gave a great example of Nature Valley, funding park services and being very intertwined with that. Like that is a very, very strong action set and permission space. And anything that falls in that is not only is it fair game to speak out on, but there's an obligation to. And if you don't, your consumers and the general public will get mad at you. But, if it's outside of that, you can be a bit more selective about what you want to speak out on.
Yeah, you get outside of that and people are like, maybe focus on the snack bars.
Yes, I think that's fair. And, as you say, anyone who owns social media can help keep their finger on the pulse of the world right now, which I think is absolutely true. So I did have another question that I wanted to ask. That's a slightly different topic, which is that from what I understand, a lot of your consumers are not just buying for themselves, they're buying for their families. So their parents, particularly with younger children. And one of the things we had talked about is that Gen Z is just starting to age into that. Which I'm sure will make a lot of listeners here feel quite old, is that Gen Z are entering their sort of, young parenting years. So I'm really curious if you have any thoughts or insights to share from that perspective and understanding Gen Z, not just by themselves, but as sort of parents in particular.
Yeah, first of all, I want to say that I had a personally traumatic event this week because I feel like for like 10 years, we've been talking about 55 plus and boomers. We've been using those synonymously. And it occurred to me that it is actually my generation that is 55 now. So that's very difficult to realize. And I could have seen it coming because it's really just math.
Emotionally traumatic.
Yeah. But I think this is a great point where, listen, it is interesting to talk about the differences between generations. It is extremely instructive to understand the shared experiences that they've gone through to shape them. It is also life stage that can define a tremendous amount about a consumer. And so, you might have more in common with someone who also has a 3-year-old child, if you have a 3-year-old child, than someone who was born that year, just because the challenges of your day are going to be kind of more about your family and your family kind of composition. And so, we have historically always been a company that is over-indexed towards households with kids. And we have some, the convenience and the solutions that we offer across a range of brands have made that true. And so very important for us to understand what are those kind of parenting values and how are we going to talk to this new generation as they become our kind of core, they will become our core constituency as we stay households with kids. And what's different, what's same. And I think there's a lot that's the same, the way that people care for their children, the way they think about the primary importance of parenthood. I think the thing that is changing is an expectation for multiple options. I think if you were to kind of really get in the Wayback Machine and say, what is the General Mills that has grown in this world to become the one it is today? You would go back to like post-World War II, GI Bill, people move to the suburbs. That car over there in the neighbor's yard is the one that I want in my yard, et cetera. And we can put a delicious, fresh product on the same shelf of every grocery store in America. I think now you have people living in very different digital worlds who might be next door neighbors, who might have different awareness of allergies and things like that, or different perception of what makes a healthy breakfast or not. And so I think for us, we need to make sure that we are continuing to and always working to develop a range of product solutions that solve this like diverse need set. And that's an evolution over a long period of time, but that I think is kind of coming into focus with Gen Z coming into their parenting years.
Yeah, so smart. And again, it all goes back to this fragmentation, because the information that we're receiving is so different based on personalized and curated algorithms. It creates totally individualized and personalized outcomes. So to your point, whereas before we were more able to generalize demographically on geography or income or age, even now as a result, if you're part of this generation or whatever it is, it's more difficult. You might not share the same values. And you made the interesting point around life stage as defining people versus just age. I think that's right. I would say for Gen Z, it's slightly less relevant because, or it's not come to the fore yet because they're just starting to have children. I'm sure over the next 5 to 10 years, though, we'll see a much broader, array as some have children and they become more similar to millennials. Some don't. And they're, still sort of similar to younger Gen Zs. What I will say, though, is that we started to see this interesting trend of actually a fragmentation within Gen Z. And this it's in our data, and it's also been reported on of like Gen Z 1.0 versus Gen Z 2.0. And it's roughly at the midway point between those ages. Gen Z 1.0 tends to be more left-leaning. They're the ones who did college or high school during COVID and had the worst impacts of that. And they tend to actually be the stereotype of Gen Z that we think of. Whereas Gen Z 1.0, they're younger, they're much more skeptical of institutions, even, tangentially more MAGA aligned. And they're actually starting to get older and have more influence, both culturally and commercially. So that for me is something I'm really interested in is, okay, how is this sort of second half of the generation, Gen Z 2.0, going to be different from the first and further change our cultural norms, not just for this generation, but across the board?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously there's no one single Gen Z, just like there's no one single multicultural consumer. But with the pace of change, it doesn't surprise me at all that your younger Gen Zs would have had a very different experience than the older Gen Zs, where they were when certain massive events happened, the popularization of things like artificial intelligence, et cetera. Like their actual experience is different from people who are not that much older than them. So that's super interesting.
Absolutely. So Doug, we're almost at time. I want to leave with one final question, which is for anyone listening, what advice or thoughts would you want to leave them with in this world, as you say, that's fragmenting, where the pace of change is only accelerating and all of these things are happening?
I would say a couple of things. First of all, I always tell people if there's one thing that I look for when I'm talking to someone and thinking about a job, is I want to see a burning sense of curiosity. I feel like you cannot coach curiosity. And so people who are interested in learning are people who will figure it out one way or another. So I tell people that, first of all. And I think I would also say that we talk a lot, and for good reason, about how much technology is changing. It's incredibly interesting. I'm kind of personally always trying to grow in that area. I think it's also worth thinking just how much people and fundamentally how we make decisions are not changing. And so what we have to do is understand the tools of technology and the way that's evolving and the way that it might be influencing decision making, but then really understanding people. Like at the end of the day, you mentioned empathy for what someone is experiencing in their life, your consumer, your customer, and then where could your brand meet them and make their day a little bit better. If you have a deep passion for learning about that and a curiosity about the world, like that's a person that I would hire.
Amen. Doug, thank you for those beautiful and wise words. Thank you so much for your time and your very insightful answers to all these questions and wonderful conversation. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in to The Trust Makers. We will see you next time.
Thank you for tuning into The Trust Makers, an Edelman podcast in partnership with Advertising Week, where we speak with leaders and other trust builders across institutions. See you next time.